Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Gott, der Vater, wohn uns bei, which translates to God the Father, be our stay. This is a fairly straightforward chorale, but just like yesterday's chorale, it has a really interesting form. We have like a fairly clear ternary-ish form going on right now. And it's interesting that we have a double repeat. Like we have a repeat at the beginning, a repeat of the middle section, and a little, either a C section or perhaps a coda. It kind of sounds to me like a coda because it's fairly stable, not really a lot of development going on, stays in one key, as opposed to the other sections which do have development or a little bit more harmonic intrigue, to say the least. We're just going to hop right into the analysis though. Content-wise, this is a longer chorale. Hope we can get through it. Two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on D major. We're pretty clearly in the key of D major here. And after our first tonic triad, we get a repeat of the same chord, so we don't need to reanalyze. D, D, F sharp, and A. We then get G, D, G, and B, which is a 4 chord, G major, in the key of D major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get E, E, G, and C sharp, which is C sharp diminished in first inversion. That's our 7 chord, 4 going to 7, very normative progression. As we're closing in on our half cadence here in the key of D major, we have D, F sharp, A, and D here, which is our tonic triad, how we would expect a 4-7 progression to resolve. Some passing tones in the lower voices here, and then we go to D, A, and D. I reckon this A is a 7-6 suspension over the bass, and it's really this G sharp that's our chord tone, which would make this G sharp diminished over B, which in other terms is 7-6 of 5, because G sharp is the leading tone to A, and A is our dominant in the key of D. Maybe this is also a 2-7 chord too. We sort of blur the line because if you include that tone, which is the suspension, we have an incomplete B minor 7 chord, which actually isn't 2-7 now that I see that. It's 6-7. It would be 2-7 in terms of A major, but it would be 6-7 in terms of D major. Same chord, just different Roman numerals because of the key that we're in. But regardless, the chord resolves where we would expect, to A major, A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our 5 chord. Alright, second and last phrase of the A section ends in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, so no modulation here, but the harmony is generally more interesting than the ending section, which is of comparable length to the opening section. 5 goes to E minor, E, E, G natural, and B, which is our 2 chord in the key of D major, so a bit of transitive harmony, but take that with a grain of salt because this is a new phrase, and by virtue of the fact that it is a new phrase, it's a separate idea. So really this isn't a 5-2 progression the same way we would comment on if it were part of the same phrase, because typically we expect it to go the other way around, but there's nothing saying that 5 can also go, nothing preventing 5 from going to 2 in theory, right? But after 2, we get a bit more transitive harmony. This sort of continues this idea where 2 is going to a destination that we would expect 2 to go to. We have B minor here, B, D, F sharp, and D. That's our 6 chord. 6 typically goes to 2, using like typical tonal narrative, but same voice leading could take you in the opposite direction. It's just another way of approaching 1. And then we go to A major. C sharp, E, E, and A. This happens to be A major in first inversion, so 5-6, and then we go to D major, D, A, E, and F sharp. This E is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. Bach really loves 9/8 suspensions over D chords especially. He uses it a lot with D minor chords, but we see them with D major chords too, like we are seeing in this case, but this is our tonic triad. And then we go to E, G, D, and G, kind of in the same way that we could call this either 7-6 of 5 or 6-7 I think you could call this 2/7 here if you wanted to, if you heard this D as the chord tone, but I think this D is actually a suspension, and it's really this C sharp that's our chord tone, and if this C sharp's our chord tone, this is C sharp diminished over E, and this creates a very common pattern that we see in Bach, 1 going to 7/6, and we would expect this to go to 1/6, F sharp, A, D, and F sharp. Tonic triad and first inversion. This pattern right here fuels a lot of the passing progressions of 1 going to 3 in the bass using this stepwise motion. And then we get some A passing tone in the bass here that prepares us for our cadence, A, D, and E. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It's really this C sharp that's our chord tone here, making this a 5 chord, A major. This G is a very brief passing 7th, and then we get D major as our final chord. D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad and root position. Alright, looking ahead to the longer, more developed, for the engines in the background, I live right on the side of a busy street. But yes, our first phrase ends in a half cadence, more specifically a Phrygian half cadence, and I'll talk about what that is when we get to it for those of you who may be new to the term. We start off the phrase in the key of D major, but we're going to be pivoting to the key of B minor at the end. We start with D major, so we don't need to reanalyze, and then we get C sharp, A, and E, which is A major over C sharp. That's our 5 chord in first inversion. This E is a chord tone, so we don't need to analyze it. And then we get D, A, E, and F sharp, again with this 9/8 suspension over the D chord. This D is our chord tone here, making this a tonic triad. And then we get another A major chord here, A, D, and F sharp. Kind of interestingly, I think we have like sort of a double suspension going on here, like a 6/5 in the melody and a 4/3 in the tenor. So maybe there's an argument to be made here that there is, sorry, I don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral here. Apologies for the sirens and whatnot. It's very busy today. I hope that person's okay, or whatever they're headed to is safe. This D is a suspension. This F sharp, I'm going to call it a suspension as well, and you could call this a 1/6/4 to maybe 5/7 progression, but I don't quite hear it that way. I hear this more as just like a double suspension. Of course, really you could analyze every 1/6/4 to 5 as sort of like a double suspension progression because of just the nature of how the chords move from one to another, but to me, I'm just going to call this a 5/7 chord. That's just how it feels to me, based on how the tones are operating in the greater context of the phrase. But there are multiple ways to interpret what's going on here. And then we have B, F sharp, D, B and D, which is B minor in root position. That's our 6 chord, so some deceptive harmony here, 5 going to 6, with a passing 7th in the bass, and I reckon this is actually where we modulate to B minor. B minor is now our tonic, and as we're closing in on our cadence, we have G, B, B, and E, which is E minor in, that is E minor in first inversion. That's no longer a 2 chord, it's a 4 chord in first inversion, because we're in B minor now, not in D major. And then we cadence on F sharp major, F sharp, A sharp, C sharp, and F sharp, which is our 5 chord in root position, our dominant. So the reason why this is a Phrygian half cadence, it's like a textbook term, it's not super important to know, but when you see this motion in the bass of the 6th of the minor scale, in this case it is a G, because we're in the key of B minor, going down to 5, which is the root of our dominant chord, this half-step motion is unique to minor and evokes, I guess, the same sort of feel that the Phrygian mode has, which is the mode that has the flat movement between the 2nd and the 1st scale degree. They're a half step apart. So it's not super important to know, but it is something that I'm looking for to see how many half cadences Bach has composed. and what proportion of them or what ratio Phrygian half cadences occur amongst them. So we're going to pretty much pivot immediately back to the key of D major. I think there's an argument in this section to be made that we pivot directly to the key of A major because our phrase ends in the key of A major here. But to me, this melody sounds undeniably in the key of D major, and whether you decide for it to look at it in the key of D major, or whether you decide that it just could be completely analyzed in the key of A major, either is totally fine. I'm so sorry about all of the motors and just noise pollution that makes it into the video. I don't have any control over it. I wish I lived in a more quiet environment, that's for sure. But yes, we have, starting off our phrase, our resolution of our half cadence here, B, B, D, and D, 2 roots and 2/3. That's a B minor resolution. And I think this becomes our 6th chord in the key of D major again. We have an interesting progression in the key of D major after the fact, because, you know, it sounds like D major in the melody here, but the chords that Bach chooses aren't traditionally the ones that I would expect to see in a D major context in terms of establishing the tonic, but we eventually do resolve to the tonic, or what I believe to be the tonic, even though there might be some room for argument. We go to F sharp, B, F sharp, and C sharp. That is F sharp, I'm saying that this B is a 4/3 suspension over the bass. And this is actually F sharp minor in root position, which is our 3 chord. And with that A natural, I feel like it's pretty clear that we've left the key of B minor at this point. That's why I feel like we've modulated to a different key on the pickup to the next phrase. And then we go to D major, D, F sharp, and D. However, with this B right here, I think there's an argument to be made that this could be 6/6, and really we could have this sort of greater 1, minor 5, 1 in the key of B minor. It just doesn't really sound that way to me, even though we actually do arpeggiate a B minor chord here in the bass. It really does feel like in this case that the melody is doing a lot more of the heavy lifting when it comes to defining what the harmony is here, because a 6-3-1 progression is not something that I would typically expect in a chorale, but if you listen to the progression, it doesn't quite sound that there's anything dominant about this progression. It's like the A that we would maybe expect to resolve to D goes to F sharp. It sort of feels like there's avoidance on all fronts here, except for the melody. So for me, that's honestly what it feels like. I think there's an argument to be made that we've been in the key of A major the whole time, because on he avoids using G sharp, which is really the only difference between D major and A major from a pitch perspective. But all in all, I say that on the next beat, it feels like he's modulating. We have C sharp, E, B, and E. I think it's pretty clear that this B is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually our 5 chord in first inversion, A major over C sharp. That also happens to be our tonic in the key of A major. And then this G sharp's a little brief neighbor tone, outlining the leading tone of the key that we're in now, A major. And that takes us to F sharp, C sharp, A, and E. And where there's maybe an argument that this is an F sharp minor 7 chord, right? Because F sharp, C sharp, A, and E spells F sharp minor 7. We could look at this really as sort of another double-ish suspension figure where this E is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and this is actually 4/6 D major over F sharp because of the 2 Ds that are being converged upon both in the tenor and in the melody. That's something that I've noticed Bach do from time to time, where we get 2 accented non-chord tones, and then Bach doubles the chord tone that's a result. That's just what it feels like to me. It doesn't really feel like there's a 6-4 progression going on here, but rather 6 and 4 are very close, and how I choose between the 2 of them in my own analysis is just based on context and just making an educated guess, and this is my educated guess. So after our 4/6 chord, we're getting ready for our cadence. So we have C sharp, E, A, and C sharp, which is A major over E. I call this C sharp. E, E, A, and C sharp. that would be A major over E, which is 1-6-4, and we would expect that to go to a 5 chord in a cadential context, which it does. E, E, G sharp, and B. That's E major in root position. Go ahead and draw a little bracket underneath those as well for those of you who learned about it that way, just like I did. This little delayed 7th as well in the tenor is just a passing tone in this case. And then we cadence on A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad. Perfect authentic cadence. Moving ahead, we have another half cadence in a different key. This time we're in the key of E minor rather than B minor. But we see a very similar phrase structure to how the previous phrase went, where we visit the key of D major, and then we end the phrase in a different key. So I think this A major chord that we see right off the bat is our gateway to the key of D major. It's still our tonic triad in the key of A major, but this G natural that happens after the fact is a flatted 7th in terms of A, so it's signaling towards D. I feel like this is now our 5 chord. After our passing 7th, we would expect a tonic triad, which we get F sharp, D, F sharp, and A. D major over F sharp, which is our 1-6 chord, passing tone in the bass, and then we get D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. So we'll just change the figure bass to reflect that, no need to rewrite the Roman numeral. We then have A, E, and C sharp, which is our 5 chord, A major. And then that resolves where we would expect after this passing tone in the tenor. Sorry, I almost forgot to mark that. D, F sharp, D, and A, tonic triad. Then we get some chromaticism here in the bass. These short ascending chromatic bass lines typically mean that the chromatic passing tone is the leading tone to the chord we're going to see afterwards. So ascending bass lines are generally less interesting than descending chromatic bass lines. But all in all, I do think this is our gateway to the key of E minor. D major now becomes our subtonic 7th, and it serves as a stable chord or as a predominant before we hear our actual dominant. This E is also a passing tone. D sharp, B, F sharp, and B is B major over D sharp. That's 5-6. And after this passing 7th of the melody, we get E, B, F sharp, and G. Another 9/8 suspension in the alto here, but this is our tonic triad E minor before we cadence on D major, B, B, E, and F sharp. Of course, this E is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and this D sharp is actually our 5 chord. Now here's some room for argument as well, because we end this phrase with another perfect authentic cadence in the key of D. However, the way we get to D is kind of up in the air, because there is an argument to be made that this chord here, which is A major, this B is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. You could make an argument that this A major chord is 4/6 in the key of E minor as a byproduct of harmonizing like the melodic minor scale, because when you raise the 6th scale degree of the minor scale, it turns your 4 chord into a major chord. But in this case, it just sounds like a separate idea to me. I feel like this is a direct modulation, and like I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. There's room for debate, and I just wanted to offer the other opinion or the other outlook on what could be happening here. So this A major chord, I'm just going to say flat out, is just 5/6. A major over C sharp. No common chord going on here. It's just how it sounds to me. You could reason it another way. That's totally fine. I could see where one would come from if they were to analyze that way. And then this resolves where we would expect to a D major chord, again with a 9/8 suspension over the bass. D, A, D, and F sharp. Tonic triad. Afterwards we get E, G, again with another suspension here. This time it's a 7/6 suspension. C sharp and G is C sharp diminished over E. 7/6, and we saw this pattern earlier. We typically know how this is going to resolve to a D major chord in first inversion. F sharp, A, another suspension here. This time it's a suspension that resolves upwards, so maybe there's an argument that we're going to 3 here, which is totally fine because 7, by the virtue of falling fifths, or just using that sort of narrative structure in harmony, 7 wants to resolve to 3. But typically in this pattern right here we see 1-6 rather than 3, and the fact that D and A are not too far off of the harmonic rhythm is not a coincidence in this case. F sharp, A, D, and A. 1-6. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we're expecting, 2 chords, 4 chords, dominant chords, and that's what we get here. G, B, D, and A. Again, another one of these double suspensions, which sort of affirmed the analysis that's going on here, because there's a very similar sort of rhythmic idea that's happening between this beat right here and this beat right here. So I liken the second phrase of this section to the fourth phrase, so maybe there's like a binary form going on here, who knows. But if this is a double suspension, actually that D ends up being part of the chord, but this A is a very clear suspension. G, B, E, and G, which would be E minor over G. That's a 2-6 chord. And then we're getting ready for our cadence, so this A, E, and F sharp. Probably this E is a kind of interesting, a 5-4 suspension. We saw one of these yesterday, I think, as well, or in a video recently. They kind of blend together for me. But 1-6-4, D major over A. We would expect this to go to a 5 chord, which it does. A, D, and E. Another one of these suspension things here, this D is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and by the time we get the resolution, the 7th gets introduced, so I'm going to call this a 5-7 chord. A7 in root position, and then we cadence on 1, D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad, root position. And now we're looking at the small section at the end of the chorale, sort of complementing our introduction actually, because they're similar in length and actually similar in profile. Just I'd say the harmony in this section is generally a bit plainer, less chordal contrast, a lot of 1s and 5s really. Actually, now that I look at it, not so much. I don't know why I said that at the beginning. They're actually quite similar to one another in terms of structure. Our first phrase ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, so not a half cadence, but similar in terms of the effect on the overall grammar of the chorale. We have F sharp, A, and D, so that's just our tonic triad in first inversion, no need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And then we get C sharp, A, and E, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. We've seen this progression a couple of times now, 1-6 going to 5-6. And that resolves where we would expect, D, A, D, and F sharp. This E is another 9/8 suspension over the bass. We've seen this especially with the D major chords a couple of times in this chorale, and just in Bach's writing in general. Tonic triad, and that goes to 5, A, C sharp, and E. Again, we have a similar progression here, where we have a 5-7 chord that could be analyzed as a 1-6-4 chord. But really, I think what's happening is another one of these double suspensions akin to what's happening here. Which makes me feel like instead of a progression going on here, it's actually a 5 chord. And actually with this passing 7th in the bass here, I think there's an argument to be made that this is actually a 5-4-2 chord as well, because it does resolve the way that we would expect to a 1-6 chord. Getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but I'll go ahead and write that as a 5-4-2, because by the time the suspensions resolve, the bass changes, so might as well treat this chord the same as the other times that occurs, and I treat the chords that way. We then get F sharp, A, D, and D. Like I mentioned, 1-6, D major over F sharp. And then we get D, F sharp, D, and D. It's kind of like putting the chord in root position, but it's not entirely intact, so it's not the biggest deal if we don't analyze it. We then have D, G, B, and E. Kind of an interesting cadence here actually. This would be E minor 7 over D, which is 2-4-2. And then we would expect that to resolve to 5-6, which would in turn resolve to 1. And that's exactly what happens. We have C sharp, we have A, and we have E. E is a shared tone, so we don't need to mark it, but this is a 5/6 chord, A major over C sharp. 4/2 chords typically resolve down by step, and the root is a fifth away going down. So typically we would expect a 2/4/2 chord to resolve to 5/6, and 4/2 chords pretty much always operate in that fashion. There are a couple of cases where they don't, but really the pieces are there. It's just not as clear as it is in the majority of cases, like in this one. And 5/6 resolves where we would expect 2/1, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic and root position. And closing out our chorale, the phrase ends in a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with D major again, D, F sharp, D, and A, no need to reanalyze, passing tones in the lower voices, and then we get F sharp, A, D, and A, which is our tonic in first inversion, some passing tones in the lower voices as well. We have G, B, E, and A, kind of a hint at some passing harmony here, but nothing fully distinguishable because of the A being held in the melody. We then go to A, C sharp, F sharp, and A with this E right here. There's probably an argument to be made that either this is a 3/6 chord, F sharp minor over A, or this F sharp is an accented non-chord tone and this E is our chord tone, making this a 5 chord. 3/6 versus 5, they're basically the same chord. I'm going to call it a 5 chord. Doesn't really matter which way you call it because the chord in this case is just made different by what's happening over the span of a beat in one of the voices. They're basically the same thing. All in all, 5 goes to kind of similarly to what we saw in our first section. Wait, did we see 5 go to 6? I swear we did. Where do we see 5 go to 6? Am I crazy? I do this from time to time in my videos where I analyze them, and here is where we saw 5 to 6. So not at the beginning, but you know, when you analyze the chorale twice in a row, sometimes it feels like you've analyzed it in the same chorale more than once, but really it was just when I was doing the first draft for this video. 5 goes to 6, very similar to what happens here. B, D, D, and F sharp, B minor, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone here in the tenor, before we get G, B, D, and G. There's an argument to be made here that this is G major in root position, but I think this D is sort of like a lower suspension, and actually this is 2/6/5, or not even 2/6/5, apologies, just 2/6, because the D is removed by the time I think the root of the chord is introduced. There's been a lot of syncopation in this chorale, which sort of blurs the line between what chords are happening and which aren't. But 2/6 versus 4, same thing happening here with 5 versus 3/6. They're basically the same chord. All in all, I'm just thinking about the normative progressions we expect to see from Bach, and if that's somehow extrapolatable and extractable, I guess, from the texture, that's where my mind tends to go, and that's just my relationship with the harmony. So there are multiple ways to interpret it. That's what I'm trying to cultivate on this channel, is or one of the things I'm trying to cultivate on this channel through my analysis, is that it's not always just one outlook. It's not right and wrong. In many cases there is nuance and shades of gray. But after this 2/6 chord or 4 chord, we have A, E, and F sharp. We've seen this before. This E is like a 5/4, interesting suspension over the bass. It's a 1/6/4, D major over A. And then we go to A, D, and E. Again, this D is another 4/3 suspension over the bass, and then the 7th gets introduced by the time it resolves. So this is a 5/7 chord, similar to how we cadenced at the end of the previous section, 5/7. And then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D. Tonic triad, root position. That's today's analysis. All in all, fairly straightforward chorale, not really too much to write home about. I'd say that the fact that we have some chromaticism here in the bass is pretty interesting, and we do have a couple of mid-phrase modulations where we start in a key that is new, so we're not continuing into a key with the previous, continuing into a phrase with the previous key, but rather, we start in B minor here, and then we quickly go to D major, but we end the phrase in A major, or we start in D major and end the phrase in E minor. That's what I mean by a mid-phrase modulation, and Bach does this from time to time. It's fairly common. But other than those two things, really straightforward chorale, a delight to analyze. And that's going to be the video. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.